Everybody. Hi everyone. This is Emily Kariya, and I am a high school teacher at Santa Monica High School in Santa Monica, California, and I teach Japanese as a foreign language. The title of my presentation and my lit review paper is the Answer Calling? The Effectiveness of Call or Computer Assisted Language Learning on Second Language Acquisition. Oops. There we go. When we were asked to think about our topic for our literature review, I thought about my students and how they can utilize technology in my foreign language classroom. I mean, let's face it, they are digital natives in a digital age, and they use their cell phones and tablets like they're an extension of their own hand. So I figured there must be a way to capture their expertise and enthusiasm for technology in my foreign language classroom. Also, I chose this topic because selfishly, I wanted to know more about programs that I could use in my classroom. So the research question for my literature review is, what kinds of programs are most effective in increasing language acquisition? And when I came up with this question, I initially thought of vocabulary programs like Quizlet or even Rosetta Stone that a lot of us are already familiar with, but through my research I found that computer-assisted language learning was actually much more. The first subsection is exposure to authentic second language texts through technology, and I thought I would begin my subsections with Professor Stephen Krashen. Some of you may have heard of him before. He is generally referred to as the godfather of second language acquisition, and in this first subsection, it discusses second language acquisition in the way he defines it as and his theory for second language acquisition. Acquisition happens when the target language is internalized, so you don't have to think about it. It's not mechanical. And Professor Krashen maintains that acquisition happens when comprehensible input is exposed to the learner, and the learner is exposed to the language in an authentic way, makes connections and meaning for him or herself. And the best way that this happens is through immersion and exposure to real, authentic texts. And by authentic texts, I mean both written and audio text, as opposed to, say, mechanical drills. So therefore, it's no surprise that Professor Krashen and Hugh Jarvis studied the use of call programs by language students using questionnaires with Thai and Arabic-speaking students studying English as a foreign language. And Jarvis and Krashen found that not many students used tutorial call programs, the traditional call programs that teach vocabulary or grammar specifically, but instead more students use the computer or other technologies to access information in English for authentic academic purposes and for social purposes like Facebook, YouTube, and whatnot, in authentic ways. So they expose themselves to the target language, comprehensible input in a more immersion style way. as opposed to the mechanical call way. Jarvis and Krashen concluded that the traditional call programs were good to monitor or self-correct vocabulary and grammar, but true language acquisition happened with the use of technology in authentic and meaningful ways. The second study by Jarvis and Mariana Achilleos continued to study the use of technology to access authentic texts. Again, the research participants were English as a foreign language students. And the researchers found that the learners preferred learning English by accessing authentic sites and apps versus using English tutorials. Surprise, surprise. Jarvis and Archelios also concluded that accessing the target language in authentic ways led to acquisition, similarly to the first study, and that the call tutorials helped with self-correction, again, similar to the first study. The second subsection of my literature review is called The Advantages and Disadvantages of Call. The first study is a lit review by Cheng-Chi Lai and William Allen Kritsonis. And the researchers concluded in their lit review that the advantages of call outweighed the disadvantages of call. And let me just read off the advantages that they found for you. Here we go. So Lai and Kritsonis concluded that the advantages of computer-assisted language learning included providing students more independence as learners, allowing students to become the creators of knowledge instead of just receivers of knowledge, providing more motivation to learn, increasing exposure to authentic texts, encouraging greater interaction between students, the teacher, and the global community, lowering anxiety, improving problem-solving skills, and providing time or repetition for students who need it. They also found that well-designed call programs were able to give personalized feedback to students. In the same literature review by Lai and Kritsonis, they concluded that the disadvantages of call included the high cost of technology and issues of equity for disadvantaged schools and students. Not a surprise there. The need for basic computer literacy to use computer-assisted language learning programs, which may not be present in the classroom, and the actual limitations of these speaking programs, so the technology of it, and the inability of computers to respond to unexpected learning problems or immediate questions, so those out-of-the-box situations. The authors, Lai and Kritsonis, also concluded that people must use call programs with the understanding that they have limitations, and, listen to this, at this time they cannot replace a human teacher. Yay! It is their finding that despite the costs and shortcomings of the technology, that call programs can benefit students in second language classrooms. The second study in this subsection is a meta-analysis by Ernesto Maccaro, Zoe Hadley, and Catherine Walter. Now, whereas Lai and Kritsonis studied call on second language acquisition in general, Maccaro and his fellow researchers focused on call on English language acquisition. Maccaro et al. Found that, let me just read this to you. There were positive findings for call programs on vocabulary acquisitions, though some technologies found no difference. They found that in their studies, a call improved grammar. Some studies also reported improvement in speaking and writing with call. They found that the effect on pronunciation with call needs further study, and there was conflicting evidence on listening and computer-assisted language learning. They also found that there was no clear advantage for call on target language reading. But in addition to these language or skill-specific benefits, like Lai and Kritsonis, Maccaro et al. Found that call offered non-language benefits that included intercultural competence, critical thinking, and motivation. The third study in this subsection is a single subject study by Cornelia Tschichold, and she studied the effectiveness of a vocabulary program that was a Welsh learning program. Again, it was a single subject study. And she found that for her particular call program, that call program had limitations, but was convenient and afforded opportunities for the learner to practice vocabulary. And in that sense, this vocabulary call program is, and others like it, are like traditional paper flashcards. So the vocabulary call programs have positive effects, are good to use, much like traditional paper flashcards. The fourth study in this subsection is a study on the use of technology by young elementary school age children learning French in Canada in an immersion program. And the type of call that the researcher Martine Pellerin studied was not the traditional tutorial call, but instead computer-assisted language learning using devices such as mobile phones and tablets for authentic motivational tasks. These tasks included, creating stories and making movies, things like that. And Pellerin found in her research that call was beneficial in 4 aspects, namely, the call activities created authentic and meaningful language learning. Second, call allowed the students to have autonomy in creating in their learning environments. Third, call increased the conscious awareness and metacognition of the students of the language learning process. And fourth, call promoted the self-reflective assessment and regulation of the language learning process. So, I particularly found interesting the way that the students used the technologies to map out their storylines, record their first product, review it, get peer feedback when they wanted it, and then redo any parts that were weak so that they came out with a better product. And so Pellerin concluded that students should use touchscreen and mobile devices to create meaningful and authentic output for task-based call in their second language classroom. Let's go to the next slide. The third subsection of my literature review I titled Preparing Teachers for Call. And I did this because teacher awareness of computer-assisted language learning and their training in call can affect how well technology is used for language learning. And so, the first study in this section was undertaken by Marina Kogan, and she studied future teachers or future language teachers in Russia and their exposure to and training in different call programs and different call techniques. She used surveys in her research, and her surveys found that students were not familiar with call at first before their training, but became familiar with it as a whole by the end of the training and the study. And in the end, Kogan concluded that the use of call in her Russian future language teachers increased motivation. Their collaborative call projects produced final projects that exceeded expectations. And so, therefore, her conclusion was future teachers can and should train in computer-assisted language learning along with the existing curriculum and instructional methods to increase learning for students in the foreign language classroom. The second study in this subsection is a study by Veronica Sardinia and Vera Dugartsi-Rinova, who conducted a similar survey of future language teachers, but this time, instead of Russia, it was in the United States. And the future American foreign language teachers used call in addition to face-to-face instruction in the classroom. And for example, they used online discussions, blogs, wikis, chats, e-portfolios, and video projects outside of class time. What the researchers found was was actually quite interesting. They found that the students or participants in their study rated online interactions such as discussion forums and blogs lower than other traditional non-digital teaching strategies. So the students or the future teachers valued the non-digital or non-technology-based activities more than the technology-based activities, the call activities. But at the same time, the students viewed these technology-based or technology-mediated activities as beneficial, and they improved their teaching skills, and they agreed that the online exchanges were stimulating, valuable, and highly relevant to course content. Also, interestingly, an overwhelming majority, 96%, agreed that the online interactions complemented the face-to-face course activities and supported their practical teaching experiences and enhanced learning in general. So both studies in this subsection suggest that instructors and learners should use technology to support but not replace traditional classroom teaching, and they should be trained in it. Next is the discussion section of my literature review. So beginning with the studies by Jarvis and Krashen and Jarvis and Archelios, the findings of both studies are similar in that both studies found that computer-assisted language learning happened through the exposure to authentic text. They also both concluded that that traditional call tutorial programs did help in monitoring vocabulary and grammar, but they did have both studies did have some shortcomings, some limitations. For example, both studies only used English language learners as their study participants. Also, the studies didn't address the social economic status of the study participants. All the study participants in both studies had access to a computer, and most of the study participants had access to mobile technologies such as smartphones and tablets. So maybe it's possible to assume that very few of these study participants came from a lower socioeconomic status. And so, would the findings of these studies have been different if the study participants had come from lower economic status, or lower socioeconomic status, excuse me. Also, both studies did not measure the fluency of participants in the target language before the intervention, so before the exposure to authentic texts via computer or other technology, and after. Another limitation was both studies did not use a control to compare with. Let's see. Let's go to the next slide, which is about the advantages and disadvantages of call. As I mentioned earlier, all these studies concluded that call overall has positive effects on language learning. The first two studies, the literature review by Lyon Kritsonis and the meta-analysis by Maccaro et al., both were very in-depth and used many sources of information to come to their conclusions. So I would consider that a strength. The weakness of the first two studies is similar to the studies by Jarvis and Crash and Archelios, in that the studies didn't really stress the impact or the variable or different variables in their research. For example, they didn't address the age of the learners. They didn't address the socioeconomic status of the learners, whether or not the learners were native English speakers or English learners learning a foreign language. They didn't make a distinction between learners of different proficiency levels before and after the introduction of call either. So those could be some limitations to these studies. The two second or the third and fourth study in this subsection, the study with the single subject Welsh learner and the study of the elementary school students studying French in Canada, they had their strengths and weaknesses as well. With regard to the single subject study, the researcher did a very thorough job of analyzing how many times the language learner, learned the same word over and over and this and that. So it was in-depth in that way, but being a single subject study, it has its limitations. Also, the the study didn't include a pre-intervention assessment, so we couldn't see what the learner could accomplish before the introduction of the vocabulary program. Also, the single subject study only measured vocabulary acquisition and didn't measure other measures of fluency. You know, did the use of the vocabulary program contribute to increased speaking, listening, reading, or writing proficiencies, for example? There was also no control in the single subject study. But, I mean, she concluded that the vocabulary program was convenient and useful and functioned very similarly to traditional paper flashcards. So for someone who likes technology, like many of my students, it could be a plus. Talking about the studying the elementary school students, she made many good observations of the use of technology by the young learners. However, her conclusions were all positive. She neglected to mention any negative impacts of computer-assisted language learning on the young students, which I was interested in learning about, but she didn't address. The third subsection was about teacher training. The Russian study and the American study of the future foreign language teachers were very similar. Both studies were qualitative. They used surveys. They came about very similar conclusions. The findings, however, actually the way that these studies were conducted, however, could be improved. For example, let me backtrack. So thinking on the limitations of these studies, we have to consider the background of the participants of the studies. It was noted in the Russian study that in Russia, very few language teachers use computer-assisted language learning in their classrooms. And this was a study from 2011, so not very long ago. So the lack of exposure to computer-assisted language learning in Russia may not be comparable to, say, the American experience. Let's see. Both studies, however, were relevant in that the researchers were able to show that both face-to-face and online teacher training or components are important to teacher credentialing and for professional development courses. So we should do training. We should be trained in computer-assisted language learning for it to be effective in our language classrooms. I'd like to go to the implications for teaching and learning. The first implication of incorporating computer-assisted language learning in the foreign language classroom is the cost, and the limitations of the technology. The technology is not perfect, but despite these disadvantages here, the benefits outweigh the disadvantages. So we should incorporate computer-assisted language learning in our teaching so that students can learn. Also, an implication is that teachers must be trained for CALL to be used effectively in the second language classroom. Also, from the learning aspect, the adoption of CALL programs and techniques not only increase language skills and language acquisition, but have non-language benefits as well, such as learner autonomy, collaboration, increased collaboration with others, increased motivation, etc. Things like that. For implications for future research, as I was going through all the studies about computer-assisted language learning, I found that there weren't too many for K through 12 students who were what we would call foreign language students. So they weren't learning English as a foreign language, and they weren't in English as a second language class. So I think more studies need to be done on the use of computer-assisted language learning with students like mine. So students who are K through 12 who are learning a foreign language or a world language. Also, as you may have noticed, not a lot of the studies used experimental or quasi-experimental design. They lacked controls. They lacked pre and post assessments and things like that. And so I think studies that are more experimental in design or quasi-experimental in design are needed for future research. So in conclusion, I found that CALL has an overall positive effect, both in the vocabulary and grammar tutorial programs, as well as computer-assisted language learning techniques, such as using e-portfolios and wikis and chats and creating videos using technology. Then say period. Also, the use of CALL in the foreign language classroom, again, has a positive effect on specific language skills and acquisition of vocabulary, grammar, speaking, and writing. And as I mentioned earlier, there are many non-language benefits by the incorporation of computer-assisted language learning, both programs and techniques. Lastly, I wanted to end with, teachers and learners need to be fluent in CALL in order to be fluent in their target language. Okay, kind of a play on words. It's all about training and knowing how to use the technology well. Okay. Here are my references. And that concludes my presentation. Good night, everybody.